In 1911, the richest man the modern world had ever produced was ordered by the Supreme Court to break his empire into 34 pieces. John D. Rockefeller did not lose that fight to a rival titan or a crusading senator. He lost it to a quiet woman from the Pennsylvania oil country who had spent 2 years at a desk, reading his own records back to him. Her name was Ida Tarbell, and she never carried anything more dangerous than a pen. She was not the only one. A ruined girl took a congressman's dynasty apart under oath. A stockbroker turned presidential candidate printed the secret that broke the most famous preacher in America. A reporter had herself locked inside a madhouse. A runaway wife put a living prophet on trial. 5 women, and no weapon between them, but the truth said out loud. Every fortress built to keep them quiet had the same flaw. If these 5 names have never been spoken to you together, that is the reason I make this channel. Subscribe and stay with me, because the women the record tried to bury are the ones you most deserve to meet. Chapter 1. A woman's word was worth nothing. In the America of the Gilded Age, a married woman could not always sign a contract in her own name, could not always keep the wages her own hands had earned, and in many a courtroom could not testify freely against the man she had married. And yet 5 women were about to prove that a single sentence, spoken in the right room, could bring down the men the whole system existed to protect. The law that governed their lives had a name, though few of them ever said it aloud. It was called coverture, an old inheritance carried over from England, and its logic was simple and total. When a woman married, her legal self folded into her husband's. Her property became his to manage. Her earnings, if she had any, were his to keep. Her body, in the eyes of the courts of the day, was largely his as well. She was, in the cold phrase of the jurists, covered, the way a small stream is covered when it runs into a larger river and loses its name. A married woman of this era was, in law, less a person than a condition of her husband. And an unmarried woman who fell, who loved the wrong man or trusted him too far, was something worse. She was a warning, a thing other mothers pointed to, a name spoken in a lowered voice. Against that fact stood a second fact, harder and stranger, and it is the engine of everything that follows. The men at the very top of this society had built their power on secrets, the rebate hidden in a railroad contract, the love letter locked in a drawer, the wife stored away in a distant house, the child given to strangers so that no one would ever count the years and do the arithmetic. Their fortunes and their reputations rested, every one of them, on the confidence that certain things would never be said in daylight. And the people best placed to say those things, the wives and the mistresses, the servants and the seduced, the poor women swallowed by their institutions, were exactly the people the law had trained to stay silent and had promised no one would ever believe. Think of each of these men as the master of a fortress. Rockefeller had his trust, a machine so vast that no rival and no state seemed able to lay a hand on it. Brigham Young had a whole territory, a church and a government fused into one, with himself at the head of both. Henry Ward Beecher had the most crowded pulpit in the nation and the love of millions. The Breckinridge family had a name that ran back to the founding of the Republic, senators and a vice president stitched into its bloodline. And the men who ran the asylums and bought the legislatures had the quiet, boring, unshakable power of institutions that no one ever thought to check. Every fortress was different. Every fortress had the same architecture. Each one was built on the belief that the truth about it could never get out, because the only people who held that truth were people no one would listen to. That belief was the flaw. It was the unlocked door at the back of every stronghold, and these 5 women found it. They were not, most of them, what the age called respectable, and they were not saints. One had given away her own children at her lover's request. One had told fortunes in a traveling medicine show and called herself a spirit medium. One faked madness so convincingly that the city's own doctors signed her into an asylum. One turned her failed marriage into a paying stage act and toured it across the country. Only the last of them, the woman at the desk in the oil country, wore the plain armor of respectability, and even she was driven by a private grievance she rarely admitted. They came from different worlds, and they never met. What bound them was the shape of what they did. Each one took a truth that a powerful man had spent years and fortunes keeping quiet. And she said it. In a courtroom, in a newspaper, on a lecture stage, in a book, in 19 Patient magazine articles. She said it out loud, in public, where it could not be taken back. And here is the thing the age never expected. It worked. The oath, the printed page, the sworn testimony, turned out to be one of the very few things the era's richest and most powerful men could not simply buy, or litigate, or wait out, or bury. A titan could crush a rival, corner a market, break a strike, own a judge. He could do almost anything except unsay a true sentence once a woman had spoken it into the record, and the record had gone out to the world. The truth, in the hands of a woman with nothing left to lose, behaved like nothing else these men had ever faced, because it did not care how rich they were. The cost of saying it was almost always paid by the woman. That is the hard center of this story, and it will return at the end. The men, most of them, kept their money. Rockefeller died richer than he had ever been. Brigham Young died the master of his church. The lecturer faded into an obscurity so complete that for decades no one even knew the year of her death. The reporter died nearly penniless. The girl who beat the congressman in open court never saw $1 of the money the jury awarded her and vanished into a foreign city. But the thing these men valued above the money, the legend, the good name, the shining public face, that never healed. The fortune survived. The story did not. There was a second force at work in these years, and without it, none of what follows could have happened. It was the rise of the cheap newspaper and the mass magazine. For most of history, the powerful had controlled not only the secrets, but the means of telling them. The pulpits and the presses and the polite journals that would never dream of printing a scandal about one of their own. But in the last decades of the century, a new kind of press came roaring up, cheap enough for a working family to buy, hungry for exactly the kind of story the old papers buried and read by millions. Joseph Pulitzer built an empire on it. New magazines sold for a dime and reached into every town in the country. And a woman with a true story and the nerve to tell it now had, for the first time, somewhere to take it that would put it in front of the whole nation before breakfast. The weapon these women wielded was the truth, but the press was the arm that threw it, and the arm had only just grown strong enough. The women themselves were shaped by wounds, and that is the last thing to hold before the stories begin. Behind each of these acts of courage sits an early injury, a humiliation, or a loss that the age would have dressed up as a private misfortune, and that we can see more clearly as the making of a fighter. A girl pulled out of the school she loved by the man who ruined her. A child put to work in a fraud, telling fortunes for coins. A young woman told in print that girls were good for nothing but the kitchen. A daughter married into a household of dozens, one name on a list. A girl who watched her father broken by a power he could not see. None of them set out to be reformers or crusaders. Each of them was made, by an injury the age handed out freely to women, into someone with nothing left to lose and one true thing to say. Over the next chapters, 5 fortresses fall, and they fall in order, from the smallest to the greatest. First, a single man's career ended in a Washington spring, then a national idol, exposed in a single issue of a newspaper. Then whole institutions, cracked open by a reporter who walked into them wearing a disguise. Then a religious empire, and the federal law that came down on it. And last, at the desk in the oil country, the largest private fortune in the history of the world, taken apart page by page by a woman who insisted, to the end of her life, that she had never had anything against being rich. She only had something against the lie. It begins with a schoolgirl and a train. Chapter 2. She met the colonel on a train. On the first day of April, in the year 1884, a young woman from Kentucky boarded a railway carriage and found herself seated near the most admired talker in the state, and by the end of that summer, he had taken her out of her college in a closed carriage, and the rest of her youth belonged to him. Her name was Madeline Pollard. She had been born in Kentucky around the year 1866, into a family that had once had a little standing and had slid downward into the genteel poverty that was harder to bear than the ordinary kind, because it remembered something better. She was clever, she read hungrily, and she wanted, more than anything, a girl of her station was supposed to want, an education. That hunger is the wound at the center of her story, and it is worth holding on to, because the man who found her understood exactly how to use it. She was studying at a female college in Cincinnati, a young woman with almost nothing but her wits and her ambition, when the train carried her into the orbit of William Breckinridge. To understand what he was, picture the Kentucky of that day and the family that sat at the top of it. The Breckinridges were not new money or new men. They were one of the founding dynasties of the American Republic. His grandfather had been a United States Senator and the Attorney General under Thomas Jefferson himself. His father was a famous minister and educator. His first cousin had been Vice President of the United States, had run for the presidency in the year of the Great Crisis, and had become a general of the Confederacy. William himself had ridden for the South as a colonel of cavalry, had guarded the fleeing Confederate president in the last days, and had come home to Lexington wrapped in that romance and gifted, on top of all of it, with a golden tongue. Men called him the silver-tongued orator of Kentucky. He could hold a courtroom, a church, a political rally in the palm of his hand. In the year he met Madeline Pollard, he was 47 years old, a married man, and on the edge of a long career in the Congress of the United States. She was 17, by her own account. The defense would later insist she was older, 20, perhaps 22, and the quarrel over those few years would become a weapon in the trial, because in the moral arithmetic of the age, the difference between a seduced child and a knowing woman was the difference between a victim and a wanton. But strip away the lawyering and the shape of it is plain enough. A man near 50, powerful, married, celebrated, and a girl with no money, no protector, and a desperate wish to be taught, met on a train. And within months he had sought her out and come to her college, and he had taken her away in a carriage with the curtains drawn, and by her testimony he had ruined her that day. She transferred to a school in Lexington to be nearer to him. Over the next 3 years, the record would later show, they met, in her words, at least 50 times. In the autumn of 1887, he arranged for her to move to Washington, where he now sat in the House of Representatives, and found her a position in the Department of Agriculture. And there they met 3 and 4 times in a week. It was a long relationship, secret and unequal, between a rising congressman and a young woman who depended on him for everything: her position, her rent, her standing, her hope. And it produced children. A first child was born in the spring of 1885, and given away to a foundling asylum in Ohio. A second was born in the winter of 1888 and lived only about 2 months. She surrendered them, she would later say from the witness stand, because he asked her to. Because if she kept them, he told her, the children would be traced to him and known as his. In her testimony, there is a sentence that carries the whole crushing logic of a woman with no power at all. She said she had done it because he asked her, and then she said, "A woman cannot do more than that." Read those words slowly, because they are the sound of coverture speaking. She had no claim on him the law would honor. She could not compel him to marry her, could not name him publicly as the father without destroying herself, could not keep her own children without exposing the man who had fathered them. Everything she had, she held at his pleasure. In the whole arrangement, she was the one with something to lose, and he was the one who set the terms, and both of them knew it. For 9 years, she kept his secret. She kept it through the births and the giving away, through the years in Lexington and the years in Washington, through the slow understanding, which must have come to her somewhere along the way, that the marriage he dangled in front of her was a door that would never actually open. And then, in the summer of 1892, the ground shifted. Breckinridge's wife died. For the first time in all those years, the man was free, and the promise he had used to keep her quiet, the promise that one day, when he could, he would make her his wife, could finally be tested against reality. He renewed it. He told her they would marry. A date was even understood between them, a wedding set for the spring of 1893. Madeline Pollard, who had given this man 9 years, 2 children, and her whole reputation, allowed herself at last to believe that the long humiliation was about to be redeemed, that the private woman would at last be made the public wife, that the debt would be paid. Look closely at the shape of those 9 years, because the whole cruelty of the age is written into them. She had come to him a schoolgirl reaching for an education, and he had answered that reaching by making her his secret. The first meetings, the visit to her college, the carriage with its curtains drawn, all of it flowed from a hunger he understood and used. In Lexington, she was near enough for him to see. In Washington, once he had placed her in the Department of Agriculture, she was a clerk by day and a hidden woman by night, seeing him 3 and 4 times in a week within a mile of the Capitol, where he made speeches about honor. He was, in public, a defender of virtue and of the old Southern code, a man who could bring a church to tears on the sanctity of the home. In private, he was undoing a young woman's life and arranging for the evidence to be carried away. The evidence was the children. A first child, born in the spring of 1885, was placed in a foundling asylum in Ohio, given to strangers so that no one would ever count backward and arrive at his name. A second, born in the winter of 1888, lived only about 2 months before it died. She gave the living one away because he asked it, because a child kept was a child that could be traced, and a child traced was a career destroyed. His career, never hers, for hers was already forfeit. That is the arithmetic of coverture in its purest and coldest form. His reputation was worth a child. Her reputation was worth nothing, because by the reckoning of the day she had none left to protect. She carried that bargain for 9 years, and the wonder is not that she finally broke it. The wonder is that she kept it as long as she did. She did not know that he was already making other plans. In the drawing rooms of Washington and Kentucky, out of her sight, the silver-tongued orator was courting someone else, a woman of good family and clean name, the kind of wife a man on his way up was supposed to have. The fortress was preparing to close its gate on her for the last time, and Madeline Pollard, who had spent 9 years learning exactly how little her word was worth against his, was about to do the one thing that no ruined woman of her age was ever supposed to do. Chapter 3. The Fallen Woman Who Refused Silence. In the last days of April, 1893, weeks before the wedding he had promised her, William Breckinridge quietly married another woman. And when the news reached Madeline Pollard, she did not disappear, and she did not die of shame, which is what the age expected of women like her. She went to a lawyer. The other woman was named Louise Wing, a cousin of his, of the sort of standing that made her a suitable congressman's wife in a way that Madeline, whatever her gifts, never could be. The marriage was done in secret and done fast, ahead of the very date on which he had told Madeline they would wed. And there is one more fact from those same weeks, small and terrible, that shows what it cost her. In the late spring of 1893, in the same season the man she loved was marrying someone else, Madeline Pollard suffered a miscarriage. She lost his child while he was choosing another bride. Whatever we imagine she felt, the record gives us only the sequence, and the sequence is enough. What she did next had almost no precedent. She sued him. She went into a court of law and charged William Breckinridge, congressman, war hero, scion of one of the great families of the Republic, with breach of promise, and she asked for $50,000 in damages. Breach of promise was, in that age, one of the very few legal weapons a wronged woman actually held. A man who promised marriage and then withdrew it could, in theory, be made to pay for the ruin he left behind. But such suits were the province of the merely jilted, of women whose reputations were otherwise intact. For a woman in Madeline Pollard's position, a self-confessed mistress, a mother of illegitimate children, to march into open court and demand that a powerful man answer for her was to do something close to unthinkable. She was not asking to be pitied in private. She was asking to be believed in public and to make him prove, in front of the nation, that he was not what she said he was. The trial opened in Washington in the second week of March, 1894, and ran for 28 days in court, before a judge named Andrew Bradley and a jury of 12 men, because women, of course, could neither vote nor sit in the jury box that would weigh one woman's word against a great man's name. The city went mad for it. The courtroom was, in the phrase of the reporters, crowded to its utmost capacity. Spectators jammed into the corridors, faces pressed to the windows from outside. The judge, offended by the frank nature of the testimony, barred women from the gallery, which is one of the small, perfect ironies of the whole affair, because it was women, out beyond the courthouse walls, who would ultimately decide the man's fate. Day after day, the papers carried the story on their front pages, from the capital to the coast. A private betrayal had become a national trial, and the thing on trial, though the indictment did not say so, was the oldest arrangement in the world, the one that let a man take his pleasure of a woman and then walk away clean while she carried the shame alone. She took the stand, and she told all of it. The train, the carriage with the drawn curtains, the years of secret meetings, the 2 children given up, the promises made and broken. The defense came at her with everything the age kept in its armory for women like her. Their strategy was as old as the double standard itself: make her the aggressor. They called her, in so many words, a self-acknowledged prostitute, a scheming woman who had pursued a good man, who had suggested the carriage ride herself, who had chased him from Lexington to Washington. They even hired a spy. A stenographer named Jenny Tucker was engaged by the defense, given the false name Agnes Parker, and sent to befriend Madeline inside a home for fallen women, to gather ammunition and feed it back to Breckinridge's lawyers. It was a campaign designed to do to her in public what had already been done to her in private, to use her own ruin as the proof that she deserved it. But something happened around Madeline Pollard that the fortress had not counted on. Other women came. Respectable women, women of standing, began to rally to the side of the fallen girl because they saw in her case something larger than one broken promise. They saw the whole machinery of the double standard laid bare, a man forgiven everything and a woman forgiven nothing, and they had had enough of it. Among the witnesses who stood up for her was the widow of a Kentucky governor, and there was a woman named Sarah Gist, once enslaved, who had been asked by Breckinridge to lie for him under oath, and who refused. Picture that refusal for a moment. A black woman in 1894, asked by one of the most powerful white men in Kentucky to perjure herself, and answering no. The people the age had trained to be silent were, one after another, declining to stay silent. The most extraordinary thing Madeleine Pollard did during the trial was not said in the courtroom at all. In the middle of it, while the nation devoured every lurid detail of her disgrace, she walked into a studio and sat for a formal portrait. A ruined woman, a public mistress, whose whole survival by the rules of the age depended on hiding her face, chose instead to have it recorded, composed, and preserved. It is the single image that holds her whole story. Not the carriage, not the courtroom, but the fallen woman who looked into the lens and refused to look away. She would not be hidden. That was the weapon. Not the lawsuit only, but the flat refusal to accept that shame was hers to carry alone. The jury was out for barely an hour and a half. They found for Madeleine Pollard, and they awarded her $15,000, a sum roughly 3 times what a congressman earned in a year. She had done it. She had taken a man whose family reached back to the founders, a war hero, an orator whom crowds adored, and she had made 12 men of his own sex agree on the record that he had wronged her. And the verdict in the courtroom was only the smaller half of his defeat. Out in the country, among the voters he needed, the men and the wives who read the papers over their breakfast, the silver tongue had turned to lead. Later that same year, though he had been a heavy favourite, Breckinridge lost the renomination that should have been his for the asking. He lost it by around 250 votes out of some 19,000 cast. The career was over. The dynasty's golden sun had been unmade in the space of a single spring by a woman he had assumed would never be heard. What makes the trial unforgettable is that Breckinridge convicted himself out of his own mouth in the very language of the double standard he had lived by. He did not truly deny the affair. He recast it. There had been no seduction, he told the court, none on either side. He said, "I was a man of passion. She was a woman of passion. It was simply a case of human passion, as though a congressman of near 50 and a schoolgirl of 17 had met as equals in a transaction of the heart." And he said the thing that lays the whole age bare, that society works upon these things differently for a man than for a woman, admitting in open court that the same act ruined her and left him untouched, and treating that unfairness as simply the weather, a fact of nature no one could be blamed for. The country heard him say it, and after the verdict went against him, the silver tongue turned at last to the language of the penitent, and he was heard to say that he had sinned and that he repented in sackcloth and ashes, which was a fine and public grief, and came too late to be worth anything to the woman he had ruined. There is a final irony in the Breckinridge story that the age could not have appreciated, and that we should. The dynasty's next torch, its claim to greatness in the century to come, would be carried not by another orator son, but by a daughter, Sophonisba Breckinridge, who became a pioneering reformer and champion of women and the poor. The family name would be redeemed, in the end, by exactly the kind of woman its silver-tongued son had spent his private life using and discarding. The fortress that Madeleine Pollard cracked was the smallest of the five, one man and one career. But she had proven the method that all the others would use in their different ways, that a woman the law had trained to hide could refuse to hide, and that her refusal, spoken in the right room, could bring a great man down. He never paid her the $15,000. His fortunes sank. When he died, 10 years later, his money was said to be at a very low ebb, and the debt to Madeline Pollard died with him. She, for her part, did not stay to enjoy her fame. She slipped out of the country and out of the record, sailed for Europe, settled at last in London, calling herself a student and a writer, and lived quietly abroad for another half-century. In this, she is the pattern for all 4 women who follow her. She won the fight and paid for the winning, while the man kept everything but the one thing that mattered. And Breckenridge was a small fortress. One man, one career, one family name. The next woman would take aim at a target the whole nation had knelt to, and she would strike him down not with a lawsuit that took 28 days, but with a single issue of a newspaper. Chapter 4. The Bewitching Brokers of Wall Street. On a winter morning in 1870, 2 sisters out of an Ohio medicine show walked into the financial heart of America on the arm of the richest man in the country, and opened the first brokerage house that women had ever run, and the men of Wall Street did not know whether to laugh or to lock their doors. The elder of the 2 was Victoria Woodhull, and no woman who ever brought down a Titan came from further down than she did. She was born Victoria Claflin in 1838 in the little town of Homer, Ohio, the daughter of a con man and patent medicine peddler, and a mother lost in visions and spirit voices. The family was poor and always moving, and the Claflin children were put to work young in a travelling show, telling fortunes, laying on hands, calling up the dead for anyone with a coin to spare. Victoria grew up performing the trade of the medium, a girl who learned early that people would pay and confide and believe if you told them what they longed to hear from the other side. She was married off at 15 to a hard-drinking doctor named Canning Woodhull, kept his name after she left him, bore a son who was never well and a daughter she raised, and by her 30s had bound her fortunes to the one person who never left her side, her younger sister, Tennessee Claflin, whom everyone called Tenny. Their road out of poverty ran straight through the most valuable man in the United States, and it ran, fittingly, through the world of the spirits. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the old Commodore, master of railroads and steamships, worth more than the treasuries of some nations, distrusted trained physicians, and had a weakness the age shared, a hunger to reach across the veil to the dead. He had lost people he loved, and he wanted them back, if only for the length of a séance. The Claflin sisters gave him that. Tenny became his magnetic healer and his medium, sat with him in darkened rooms, and let him believe she was carrying his questions to the wife he had lost. And by every contemporary account, she became his intimate as well, close enough that talk of a marriage proposal followed her for the rest of her life. Whether the old man ever truly proposed, we cannot say. What is certain is that his favor and his stock tips turned 2 penniless mediums into rich women almost overnight. In the great gold panic of 1869, acting on what they learned in his circle, the sisters claimed to have cleared some $700,000, a fortune that would run into many millions in the money of today. They did not hide the money, and they did not spend it quietly. In 1870, they opened Woodhull, Claflin and Company, a brokerage on Broad Street in the financial district, and the newspapers, delighted and appalled, dubbed them the Bewitching Brokers and the Queens of Finance. Women did not do this. Women did not stand behind a counter in the temple of American money and trade in stocks. while men in top hats gathered on the pavement to gawk. And the sisters were only getting started. Weeks later, they founded their own newspaper, Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly, and used it to preach every idea the respectable world found dangerous: votes for women, spiritual freedom, the reform of marriage, the rights of labor. It was the Weekly that first printed in English an excerpt of the manifesto of a German exile named Karl Marx. At its height, the paper reached some 20,000 readers. Victoria Woodhull had begun as a fortune teller in a wagon. Now she owned a brokerage and a press, and she was about to reach for the highest thing in the land. In January of 1871, she stood before a committee of the Congress of the United States and argued that women already had the right to vote, that the Constitution as written required it. And in doing so, she became the first woman ever to address a committee of the national legislature. She had announced the year before that she would run for President of the United States, and in the spring of 1872, a new party, the Equal Rights Party, gathered at Apollo Hall in New York and nominated her. For her running mate, they named the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass, though no one had asked him, and he never acknowledged it or lent it an hour of his time. It was audacious past the point of reason. A woman who could not legally cast a ballot presenting herself for the highest office in the Republic, and she knew exactly what she was doing. She was forcing the country to look at the gap between what it said it believed and what it actually allowed. She had already, by then, said aloud the thing that made her the most notorious woman in America. In November of 1871, on the stage of Steinway Hall, before a crowd that hissed and roared, she was challenged to admit whether she truly held the scandalous doctrine the papers accused her of, the doctrine of free love. She did not flinch. "Yes," she said, "I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional, and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please. And with that right neither you nor any law you can frame have any right to interfere." It was the most dangerous sentence a woman could speak in that hall, and she spoke it looking her hecklers in the face. Picture the scene at the brokerage, because it tells you everything about the nerve of the woman. On Broad Street, in the money district where no woman had ever stood as a principal, the sisters hung out their sign and opened their doors, and the men of Wall Street came, some to trade, and many simply to stare, crowding the pavement outside to catch sight of the two females who dared to deal in stocks. Reporters filled columns with it. Some came to mock and left unsettled, because the bewitching brokers, whatever else they were, knew the business and did it. And behind the brokerage ran the newspaper, and the newspaper printed things that no respectable sheet would touch: arguments for the vote and for the reform of marriage, for the rights of working people, and once, famously, the first English rendering in America of the manifesto of Karl Marx. A woman who had begun by telling fortunes for coins now sat astride a brokerage and a press and a campaign for the highest office in the land. And she used all three to say, again and again, the one thing the age most wanted unsaid, that the respectable world was a performance, and the men who ran it were not what they claimed. Her enemies were the guardians of respectable morality, the preachers and editors who denounced her as a harlot and a fraud, and that collision is the seed of everything that came after. It was a war of the respectable against the disreputable, the anointed against the fortune-teller who had climbed out of a medicine show. Here was a woman condemned on every side for saying openly that love should be free, while the men who led the condemnation were, she was certain, doing in private the very thing they damned in her. And Woodhull, cornered and attacked, reached for the one piece of knowledge that could turn the whole assault around. If the most beloved preacher in America, a pillar of that same moral establishment, was living a secret that gave the lie to his every sermon. Then she would print it and let the country judge who the real hypocrite was. Here is the point that the age missed and that we should not. Victoria Woodhull's enemies painted her as a creature of appetite, a woman who preached free love because she wanted license for her own. But her real argument was never about her own desires. It was about hypocrisy. She had watched, up close, how the men who ruled society lived one way in private and preached another in public. And she had decided that the sin worth exposing was not the loving, but the lying about it. She believed the men who denounced her from their pulpits and their newspapers were doing, behind their own closed doors, exactly what they condemned in her, and that the whole moral order of the Gilded Age was a performance, a gilded front nailed over a rotten frame. She was a medium by trade, a woman who had spent her life reading what people hid, and she had come to know a secret about the most beloved man in America, a secret that would prove her whole case in a single stroke. All she had to do was print it. She owned the press. She had the nerve. And in the autumn of 1872, with the presidential election only days away, she decided the time had come to say out loud what a great preacher had spent years praying no one would ever say. Chapter 5. She printed what a preacher hid. On the 2nd of November, 1872, Victoria Woodhull put the private life of the most famous clergyman in America into the pages of her newspaper, and before the sun had set, she was under arrest and on her way to a cell. The man she named was the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, and to understand the size of what she did, you must understand what he was. Beecher was not merely a popular preacher. He was, arguably, the single most beloved public figure in the United States, the pastor of Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, where thousands crowded every Sunday to hear him, a voice for abolition and reform, a name spoken with reverence in half the parlors of the country. His was a household name in the truest sense, a man whose goodness the public treated as settled fact. And Victoria Woodhull, in her own newspaper, told her readers that this paragon had for years been carrying on an affair with Elizabeth Tilton, a married woman, the wife of his own friend and protégé, Theodore Tilton. She did not do it, she insisted, to wound him for the loving. She did it for the lying. Here was the most revered moralist in America, a man who thundered against exactly the kind of free union she had been pilloried for defending, and he was, by her account, practicing in secret the very thing he damned in public. That was the whole point. If the country was going to destroy her for saying openly that love should be free, then it would have to look at what its saints were doing quietly behind the curtain. She printed it as an act of war on the double standard itself. The reaction was volcanic. The issue sold out, and then sold out again, and men and women who could not get a fresh copy paid as much as $40 for a back number, an enormous sum, passed hand to hand like contraband, and the machinery of the state came down on her at once. That very day, the 2nd of November, Victoria Woodhull, her sister Tenny, and Victoria's husband, Colonel Blood, were arrested, charged under the federal laws against sending obscene material through the mail, the same crusading regime of censorship associated with the reformer Anthony Comstock. The charge was obscenity, but the crime, everyone understood, was speaking. They were taken to the Ludlow Street jail and held for the better part of a month. And so it happened that on Election Day, the 5th of November, 1872, the first woman ever to run for President of the United States spent the day behind bars, unable to cast a vote even for herself. Months later, after roughly half a year of legal ordeal, she was acquitted, largely on a technicality. She had been jailed not for lying, but for telling a truth the powerful did not want told. And the truth, once told, could not be put back. The scandal she lit burned for years. In 1875, the wronged husband, Theodore Tilton, brought Beecher to court himself, suing the preacher over the affair. The trial gripped the nation for close to 6 months, from the dead of winter into the following summer, a spectacle of testimony and denial and packed galleries. In the end, the jury could not agree. They voted 9-3 in the preacher's favor, which meant that 9 men believed him innocent and 3 believed him guilty, and so there was no verdict at all, only a hung jury, and the accused walked out neither convicted nor cleared. His own church gathered a council and formally exonerated him, and he kept his pulpit and his fame and his lecture income to the end of his days. By the crude scoreboard of the law, Beecher won. By the only scoreboard that lasts, he did not. Before Victoria Woodhull printed that issue, Henry Ward Beecher was a saint, his goodness beyond question, his name a kind of blessing. After it, he was forever the preacher who had been dragged through the papers and the courts over another man's wife, the man the jury would not quite acquit, the great moralist with the asterisk beside his name. The doubt never lifted. To this day, he is remembered less for his sermons than for the scandal, the single most sensational exposure of hypocrisy the century produced. A woman the age called a witch and a harlot had reached up from the very bottom of respectable society and pulled the halo off its most cherished head, and it never went back on straight. There is an eerie thread running under this whole story, and it deserves to be seen plainly rather than laughed away. Victoria Woodhull genuinely worked as a spirit medium. She said in all seriousness that she was guided by voices from beyond, that the spirit of the ancient Greek orator Demosthenes appeared to her and directed her course. The rooms where she built her fortune were séance rooms. The old Commodore's belief that she could summon his dead was the hinge her whole rise turned upon. Now, we can give this a grounded reading, and it is probably the true one. The trade of the medium is the trade of reading people, of learning their griefs and their hungers, and telling them what they most want to hear. And a woman that's skilled at reading the secret wishes of the powerful was exactly the woman who could also learn and use their secret sins. Her clairvoyance and her exposures may have been the same gift turned to 2 different ends. Whether anything ever truly spoke to her from the dark, no one can prove. And it is fair to leave that door open. What is certain is that the living men who underestimated her, who thought a fortune-telling girl from a wagon show could be used and then discarded, learned that she saw further into their houses than they had ever meant to let her. The trial of 1875 was a national theatre of a kind the country had never seen, and it dragged everyone in the triangle through the mud together. Theodore Tilton, the wronged husband who had once been Beecher's devoted protégé, sat across the courtroom from the man he had worshipped. Elizabeth Tilton, the wife at the centre of it, was destroyed whichever way the verdict fell, believed or disbelieved, guilty or wronged. And the preacher, the great voice of the age, spent close to 6 months of his life answering for his private conduct in front of a jury, while the whole country read the transcripts like a serial. That the jury split 9-3 and hung, that his church then gathered and cleared him, that he kept his pulpit. None of it undid the essential fact that the country had now looked, for half a year, straight into the private life of the man it had trusted most, and could not look away from what it had seen. And the woman who had opened that curtain paid for it long before the trial ever began, and kept paying. The arrest on the day of publication, the month in the Ludlow Street jail, the endless prosecutions and legal fees, the doors of every respectable house in New York closing against her. All of it fell on Victoria Woodhull, while the preacher she had exposed went on preaching. She had reached the top of American life: a brokerage, a newspaper, a run for the presidency, and the very act that proved her point about hypocrisy was the act that cast her out of the world she had climbed into. She had traded her own place in society for the truth about a man the society worshipped, and by the crude accounting of the moment, it looked like a ruinous trade. Only the long view would show what she had actually bought. Her own fall was steep and swift. The arrests and the endless legal bills, the scandal and the ostracism wrecked the sisters financially and socially. Victoria divorced Colonel Blood in the autumn of 1876, and then, in 1877, the Vanderbilt story closed its circle in a way that has the ring of the age all over it. The old Commodore had died, and his fortune was being fought over by his heirs, and it is widely reported that his son paid the sisters a sum, said to be around $1,000, to leave the country, plausibly to keep their knowledge of the family and its séances out of the will contest. Whether that payment was exactly as described, we cannot be sure, but leave the country they did, in the summer of that year, sailing for England. There Victoria Woodhull remade herself one last time, the way she had remade herself so many times before, into respectability. She married a wealthy English banker named John Biddulph Martin in 1883, became a lady of means, and lived on until 1927, dying at the age of 88, decades after the man whose legend she had broken. Beecher had answered her with the full weight of his church, his fame, and the law, and he had survived all of it. And still she had beaten him, because the one thing none of his power could do was unprint the truth. One issue of a newspaper had done to a national idol what no rival preacher and no hostile editor had managed in a lifetime. But a legend is one kind of fortress. The next woman went after something harder and colder, the institutions themselves, the asylums and the machines of graft that ran on the certainty that the powerless could be locked away and no one would ever hear them. And to bring one of them down, she did something none of the others dared. She walked in through the front door, in disguise, and let it swallow her. Chapter 6. To expose the madhouse, she went in. In the autumn of 1887, a young woman of 23 set out to feign madness convincingly enough to be committed, and within a day she had convinced a judge, the examining doctors, and the officials of the city of New York that she belonged in an asylum, which is precisely where she wanted to go. Her name in the papers was Nellie Bly, though she had been born Elizabeth Cochran in 1864 in a Pennsylvania hamlet named for her own father, a mill owner and local judge. She had come up hard and clever. When a newspaper in Pittsburgh ran a smug column about what girls were good for, meaning marriage and the kitchen and little else, a furious young Elizabeth fired off a reply signed only the lonely orphan girl, and the editor, struck by the fire in it, tracked her down and hired her. She took her pen name from a popular song, and she took to the work like someone who had found the thing she was made for. But a woman in the newspaper trade of that day was meant to write about fashion and flowers and the doings of society. Nellie Bly wanted the front page, so she went to New York and she talked her way into the offices of Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, the loudest and boldest paper in the country, and they gave her an assignment designed to break her or make her. "Get yourself committed to the women's asylum on Blackwell's Island," they said, "and tell us what happens inside." Blackwell's Island sat in the East River, a long, narrow strip of institutions, the almshouse and the prison and the madhouse, where the city put the people it wished to stop seeing, the poor, the criminal, the mad, and a great many women whose only true affliction was that no one powerful cared what became of them. To get inside, Bly had to perform madness convincingly enough to fool the gatekeepers, and she did. She took a room in a boarding house for working women, and there she feigned insanity, behaving strangely enough that she was soon handed over to the authorities as a case for the asylum. She was taken before a judge, where she feigned a loss of memory, and then to the doctors at Bellevue, who examined her and pronounced her insane, one after another, with a confidence that should chill anyone who reads it. She was sane. She was performing, and the experts could not tell or did not trouble to. She was declared mad and shipped across the water to the island, and the door of the asylum closed behind her. What she found inside she recorded with a reporter's flat, deadly precision, and it is the precision that makes it unbearable. The food was spoiled and all but inedible. The rooms were freezing. There was no exercise, no kindness, no care. The baths were the worst of it. Buckets of ice-cold water poured over the head of one shivering woman after another in the same grey tub. In her own words, she got one after the other, 3 buckets of water over her head, ice-cold water. The nurses were coarse and brutal. Rats moved through the wards. And there was one image she carried out that stands for the whole place, an image no one who reads her account ever forgets. Out in the frozen yard, for their exercise, the patients were made to walk in a long line, and to keep them together, the attendants ran a single heavy cable rope down the row and locked it to a wide leather belt at the waist of each woman, 52 women in all, bound to one rope and dragged around the yard like a chain of prisoners or of animals. She described it exactly so. A long cable rope fastened to wide leather belts, and these belts locked around the waists of 52 women. And here is the discovery that made the madhouse a true horror rather than merely a cruel one. Once she was inside, Nellie Bly stopped pretending. She dropped the act entirely and behaved and spoke as sanely as she knew how, reasoning, requesting, explaining. It made no difference at all. The more sanely she talked and acted, she wrote, the crazier she was thought to be by all except one physician. She had walked into a machine that was built so that no protest could ever prove sanity, a place where the very act of insisting you were well was read as further proof that you were sick. She called it, in a phrase that has outlived everyone involved, a human rat trap. It is easy to get in, she wrote, but once there, it is impossible to get out. What, she asked, except torture, would produce insanity quicker than this treatment? It was a question aimed straight at the institution, and it landed. The genius of what Bly had done was that she made herself the evidence. She could have gathered second-hand accounts, interviewed former patients, quoted reformers, and the powerful would have shrugged it all off as the ravings of the discharged and the disgruntled, which was exactly why the system had always been safe. Instead, she had put her own sound mind inside the machine and proven, by her own 10 days of documented suffering, that a sane woman could be swallowed by it on the word of a stranger and could not talk, reason, or plead her way back out. When the World published her account, first under the headline behind asylum bars in October of 1887, and then in a second installment, and then in a book that same year, there was no shrugging it off. The woman who wrote it was manifestly, brilliantly sane. That was the point of the whole exercise, and the powerful had no answer to it. She had gone in with her eyes open and a single blunt question, which she set down at the very start of her account. Could I pass a week in the insane ward at Blackwell's Island? She wrote. I said I could, and I would. And I did. The getting in was almost frighteningly easy, and that ease was itself part of what she exposed. She had only to behave strangely for a short while in a boarding house and to feign a lost memory before the judge, and the ordinary machinery of the city did the rest. A policeman, a courtroom where she played at having lost her memory before a kindly judge, an examination at Bellevue where the doctors bent over her and conferred and pronounced. At each gate, a man of standing looked at a calm young woman and certified her insane, and passed her along to the next gate, and not one of them caught the performance. The doors that were so easy to walk through were the same doors that, for the truly poor and truly friendless, never opened again. Inside, she made a discovery worse than any single cruelty. It was that the place was a machine for manufacturing the very madness it claimed to treat. The cold, the hunger, the sleeplessness, the terror, the utter absence of anything to do or anyone to talk to. All of it would drive a sane woman toward the edge, and the nearer she was driven, the more justified her keepers felt. She watched women who had arrived, frightened, become, week by week, genuinely broken, and understood that the institution was answering its own accusation, making mad the people it had declared mad. She saw the immigrant and the friendless warehoused among the truly ill, women whose only real crime, as far as anyone could tell, was poverty and the bad luck of having no one to speak for them. It was the fortress in its purest institutional form, quiet, respectable, unwatched, running smoothly on the certainty that no one who mattered would ever look inside. And a girl of 23, with a fixed stare and a borrowed name, had looked. The result was not sympathy alone, but action, the rarest thing. A grand jury was convened to investigate the asylum, and Nellie Bly herself assisted it, guiding the investigators through the wards she had endured. The committal procedures were tightened, and the money that had been starving the place was loosened. A great increase in the budget for the care of the insane, cited in her own account and in the retellings that followed at around $1 million, though some careful historians put the specific rise somewhat lower. Either way, a poor woman with a false face had walked into one of the quiet, unchecked institutions of the age and forced the city to spend a fortune fixing what she exposed. The doctors who had signed her in, the officials who ran the island, the whole comfortable machinery that had assumed no one important would ever look, had been made to answer to a girl who was good at pretending. And having brought down an institution from the inside, Nellie Bly turned the same weapon on a man, a fixer at the very heart of how power was really bought and sold in America, who thought he was talking to a harmless lady and told her everything. Chapter 7. The King of the Lobby fell. A year after she walked out of the madhouse, Nellie Bly walked into a hotel in Albany, dressed as the wife of a patent medicine manufacturer, sat down across from the most powerful fixer in the state of New York, and let him tell her, in his own words, which lawmakers he could buy. The man was Edward Phelps, and the newspapers called him the King of the Lobby, the master of the quiet business of bending legislators to the will of whoever paid him. In 1888, the world sent Bly to expose him, and she did it with the same method that had beaten the asylum, by becoming someone else and letting the powerful man condemn himself. She played a lobbyist's wife with an interest in killing a certain bill, and Phelps, flattered and unguarded, obliged. He named the legislators he claimed he could deliver, and the price of delivering them, a fee that ran to something like $1,000 and more, the machinery of corruption described aloud by the man who ran it, to a woman he took for a harmless amateur. She did not pay him. She printed him. And the King of the Lobby, exposed on the front page, was disgraced and left Albany. It would be too much to say she broke the whole graft machine of the state, which outlived her by generations, but she had reached into the smug, unwatched heart of it and pulled one of its masters into the light, and she had shown the public exactly how the thing was done. By now, Nellie Bly was the most famous newspaper woman in America, and she made herself more famous still with a feat that had nothing to do with exposure and everything to do with nerve. In the winter of 1889, she set out to race around the whole world faster than any human being ever had, chasing the imaginary record of the fictional traveller in the novel by Jules Verne, who had circled the globe in 80 days. She left the docks of Hoboken in New Jersey on a November morning aboard a steamer, carrying a single small bag, and she went east, across the Atlantic and through Europe, where she stopped to meet the aged Verne himself at his home in France, and on across the Middle East and Asia and the Pacific, unknowing that a rival paper had sent another young woman racing the opposite way to beat her. She came home to a hero's welcome in January of 1890, having gone all the way around the Earth in 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds. The girl who had been told what girls were good for had beaten the record of that fictional traveller and the imagination of the man who invented him. And then her life took a turn stranger than any of her stunts. In the spring of 1895, at the age of 31, Nellie Bly married a millionaire. His name was Robert Seaman, a manufacturer of hardware and steel goods, and he was more than 40 years her senior. A man of 73 marrying a woman of 31. And the cynics muttered that the marriage itself must be some new piece of stunt reporting. When he died a few years later, she did the last thing anyone expected of a celebrity reporter. She ran his company. She took over the ironclad manufacturing works in Brooklyn, which made steel barrels and containers, and for a time she ran it well, employing some 1,500 workers and turning out around 1,000 steel barrels a day. She was an inventor in her own right, holding patents on an improved milk can and a stacking steel barrel, real and practical designs filed under her married name. For a few years, the fortune-teller's apprentice who had faked her way into a madhouse was a genuine industrialist, a woman who owned the factory rather than reporting on it. It did not last. Employees embezzled from the company, fraud and litigation followed, and the business slid into bankruptcy in the years around 1911, and the fortune was gone. Nellie Bly went back to the only work that had never failed her. She reported from the Eastern Front of the Great War in Europe, one of the first women to do it, and she wrote a column of advice and of pleas for orphaned children in her last years. And she died of pneumonia in New York in January of 1922, at the age of 57, with very little money to her name. She fits the pattern that binds all these women as neatly as any of them. She had cracked an asylum, disgraced a fixer, and circled the earth. And the world she exposed rolled on, largely intact, while she ended poor. But the reforms she forced were real, and the method she invented, the reporter who becomes the story in order to break it open, outlived her by a century. She had proven that the locked institutions of the age could be entered and exposed by anyone brave enough and clever enough to walk in wearing the right face. The sting itself is worth seeing in full, because it pulled back the curtain on how the laws of a great state were actually made. Bly met the lobbyist in a hotel in Albany, in the shadow of the Capitol where the people's business was supposed to be done, and she played her part so well that the man never suspected he was talking to a reporter. He wanted her account, and to win it, he showed off. And the showing off was the whole confession. He explained the trade as a tradesman explains his craft, which lawmakers could be had, and for how much, how a troublesome bill could be quietly killed, what the going rates were, the machinery of corruption described in a comfortable hotel room by the man who oiled it. He thought he was impressing a client. He was dictating his own exposure to the front page of the most widely read paper in America. When it ran, the men whose names had been traded like goods scrambled for cover, and the king of the lobby, who had ruled by staying in the shadows, could not survive the light and left the city. She had shown ordinary readers something they had always half suspected and never seen proven, that behind the marble and the oratory, laws were bought. The race around the world was a different kind of triumph, pure spectacle, and it made her the most famous woman in the country. The drama was sharpened by a secret she did not even know at the start, that a rival magazine, stung by the world's stunt, had rushed a second young woman named Elizabeth Bisland onto the road going the opposite way, so that two women were circling the earth in a race against each other and against the clock. Bly went east with a single small bag and one sturdy dress, a woman alone crossing oceans and continents in an age when a lady was not supposed to travel to the next town unescorted. She stopped in France to meet the aged novelist whose fictional traveller she was chasing, shaking the hand of the man who had imagined the feat she was now performing in the flesh. And when she came home, the country met her like a returning general, with fireworks and crowds and her name in every headline, because she had taken the boast of a made-up Englishman in a novel and beaten it as a real American woman, with nothing but nerve and a train timetable. What ties the madhouse, the lobby, and the race together is a single invention, and it was Nellie Bly's, and it outlived her by 100 years. She had worked out that a reporter could do more than report a story from the outside. She could become the story, put her own body and her own wits inside the thing she meant to expose, and come out carrying proof that no official denial could touch. It was a method built for exactly the fortresses of her age, the institutions and the fixers who were safe only so long as no credible witness ever got inside. And like every one of these women, she paid for her boldness in the end. The fortune she married into and then earned, running a real factory with some 1,500 workers, turning out steel barrels by the thousand, was stolen out from under her by dishonest men she trusted, and she died with almost nothing, in a rented room, having circled the globe and cracked an asylum and shamed a state. The method survived. The woman did not keep the winnings. It is the pattern again, exact. The men she beat were administrators and fixers, powerful in the grey way of institutions. The next woman took on a man who was not merely powerful, but holy, the head of a church and a government at once, whom tens of thousands of his followers believed to be a living prophet of God, and she took him on from the most intimate position imaginable, from inside his own marriage. Chapter 8. The prophet took a 19th wife. When a young woman named Anne Eliza Webb married Brigham Young, she became, by her own reckoning, the 19th living wife of the most powerful man between the Missouri River and the Pacific Ocean, a man who was at once the head of a church, the former governor of a territory, and to his followers the mouthpiece of the Almighty on earth. She had been born in 1844 in Nauvoo, Illinois, the gathering place of the Latter-day Saints, and she had been raised inside the faith and inside its most controversial practice from her first breath. Her own father took plural wives. Polygamy was not an idea to her, or a doctrine debated in the abstract. It was the shape of the house she grew up in, the arithmetic of her childhood, mothers plural and half-brothers and half-sisters beyond counting. The family made the long, harrowing migration west with the Saints, out of Illinois and across the plains to the valley of the Great Salt Lake, and there she grew into a bright, restless young woman inside a world sealed off from the rest of America, a world with its own prophet, its own law, and its own economy, all of them running through one man. At 18, she married a man named James D. in an ordinary marriage of one husband and one wife, and it went badly. She bore 2 sons, and she came to describe her husband as the man who blighted her life, and after a few years she divorced him, which the community permitted. And then, in 1868, she made the marriage that would define her and undo him. She married Brigham Young. She was about 23 years old. He was about 66, the president of the whole church, the ruler in all but name of the territory of Utah. To marry the prophet was, in that society, the highest honor a woman could be given, and by her own account it felt to her from early on like a kind of imprisonment. She is remembered by a number, the 19th wife, and honesty requires us to pause on that number because it is not as simple as it sounds. 19 was her own chosen designation, her count of herself among his living married wives at the time she joined them. Others have counted differently. One famous biography of her is titled with the number 27. By some careful modern reckonings, counting every woman ever sealed to Brigham Young in the Church's eternal rites, she was closer to the 52nd. The truth is that the exact tally is genuinely uncertain and probably unknowable, because the categories themselves are slippery. A living conjugal wife being a different thing from a woman sealed to him for eternity alone. What matters is the order of magnitude, and the order of magnitude is staggering. Brigham Young is usually credited with somewhere around 55 or 56 wives across his life, and with something like 56 or 57 children. Anne Eliza was one woman in a household that was less a family than an institution, one name on a very long list, and the number she chose for herself, the 19th, became the brand she would carry across the country when she turned on him. His power is difficult to overstate, because it was of a kind that hardly exists in American life anymore. He was the president of the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the successor to its martyred founder, believed by the faithful to speak for God. He had served as the governor of the territory of Utah. In his person, the church and the state were fused. The spiritual and the temporal ruled from the same desk. The wealth was of the same order, and it was, then as now, hard to measure precisely, because his own property and the church's property ran together. When his marriage came apart in public, the question of exactly how rich he was became a matter of open dispute, with figures thrown about that ranged from a few $100,000 to many millions. What no one disputed was that Brigham Young sat at the summit of a world he had largely built, that the roads and the settlements and the industries of a whole territory answered to him, and that the tens of thousands of saints who had followed him into the desert regarded a word from his mouth as very nearly the word of heaven. The world she was raised in has almost no parallel in American life, and it is worth entering slowly. It was a whole society built from nothing in a desert valley by people who had been driven out of the settled states for their faith. A commonwealth with its own prophet at its head, its own economy, its own courts, and its own peculiar family arrangements sanctioned as Holy Writ. A girl in that world grew up understanding that the highest law was the word of one man, and that a woman's part in the divine plan was to marry, and often to marry into a household she would share with other wives. Anne Eliza had seen it in her own father's house before she ever lived it in the prophet's. She knew the arithmetic of the sister wives, the shared husband, the children beyond counting, the careful management of jealousy dressed up as sanctity. She was not an outsider peering in. She was a daughter of the system, which is exactly what made her testimony, when it came, so hard to wave away. Her marriage to the prophet placed her at the very center of that system, and, by her account, taught her what it cost. She entered a household that was less a family than an institution of state, a sprawling establishment of wives and children and dependents all revolving around one aging, absolute man. She was young, and she was one of many, and the honor of the match curdled, in her telling, into a sense of having been absorbed, catalogued, and set aside. Set the numbers beside her one small life, and the scale becomes clear. Brigham Young is generally credited with something on the order of 55 or 56 wives across his lifetime, and with some 56 or 57 children, a household that was itself a kind of small nation. His wealth ran together with the church's and could be counted in the hundreds of thousands or the millions, depending on who did the counting and to what end. He had governed a territory. He commanded the loyalty of tens of thousands who believed his word was very nearly the word of God. To be the 19th wife, or the 27th, or the 52nd, of such a man was to be a single thread in an enormous tapestry, and to pull that thread, as she was about to, was to risk everything against a power that had never been successfully defied from within. Her road to the prophet's household ran through an early marriage that failed, and that failure matters, because it taught her that a woman in her world could, under the right conditions, walk away from a husband and survive it. At 18, she had married a young man named James D., an ordinary union of one man and one wife, and it went badly enough that she came to speak of him as the man who blighted her life. She bore 2 sons inside that marriage, and then, after a few years, she divorced him, which her community allowed. So when the aging prophet turned his attention to her, she was a young, divorced mother, and the match was presented to her as an honor almost beyond refusing, the chance to be sealed to the most exalted man in their whole world. To decline the prophet was nearly unthinkable, wrapped as the request was in the language of duty and salvation. She consented and stepped into a house of dozens of wives and discovered, in her telling, that the honor felt from the inside like a cage. The very thing that made the marriage glorious in the eyes of the faithful, that it bound her to the ruler of the church, was the thing that left her one small figure among many in a household she could never hope to be first in. To take on such a man, from any direction, was almost unimaginable. Rivals could be disciplined, doubters could be shamed. The federal government itself had tried to bring the territory to heel and had mostly failed. And the one person in all the world with the standing to expose the private truth of the prophet's household, the daily reality of life as one wife among dozens, was a wife. And a wife was the very definition of a person whose word was supposed to count for nothing against her husband's. Anne Eliza Young held that intimate, dangerous knowledge. The knowledge of what plural marriage actually felt like from the inside, from a woman's side of it. And in the summer of 1873, she decided to do what no wife of Brigham Young had ever done. She walked out, and she took him to court. Chapter 9. She sued a living prophet. In July of 1873, Anne Eliza Young left the house of the prophet, went to a lawyer, and filed for divorce and for alimony. And in doing so, she forced the entire United States to confront a single explosive question: whether her marriage to Brigham Young had ever been a real marriage at all. That question was the genius and the danger of what she did, and it cut in 2 directions at once. Under the law of the land, plural marriage was not legal marriage. A man could have only one wife the courts would recognize, and Brigham Young had recognized wives before Anne Eliza. So in the strict eye of the law, she was not his wife and never had been, and could no more sue him for divorce than a stranger could. But to say that out loud, to have the courts declare that the prophet's plural wives were not wives, was itself a devastating admission, because it branded those unions as something other than marriage, and the women in them as something other than wives, in the plain hearing of the whole country. She had built a trap with no safe exit for him. If the court treated her as his wife, then the prophet was a bigamist many times over, exposed in open proceedings. If the court treated her as not his wife, then the sacred marriages at the heart of his church were, by the law of the United States, no marriages at all. Either way, the private doctrine came out into the daylight, and the daylight was merciless. She charged him with neglect, with cruel and inhuman treatment, and with desertion the ordinary language of the divorce court turned against an extraordinary man, and she asked for money, which made the whole thing concrete and impossible to ignore. She requested $1,000 a month to live on while the case went forward, $20,000 for her lawyers, and $200,000 as a final settlement. Those were enormous sums, and they were meant to be, because they forced the court to put a number on the prophet's wealth and a value on the years she had given him. The proceedings dragged through the courts, and they produced a spectacle that the enemies of the church could hardly have improved upon if they had scripted it. The court ordered Brigham Young to pay her $500 a month in temporary support, along with $3,000 in costs. He refused. And so the ruler of the territory, the living prophet, was held in contempt of court, and in the spring of 1875, he was sentenced to a day in jail and fined $25. The sum was trivial, and the humiliation was total. The papers of the nation carried the image of Brigham Young, master of Utah, made to answer to a judge at the suit of the wife who had run away from him. The case would grind on for years and end, at the last, in 1877, with a dismissal, and the ground of the dismissal was the very paradox she had built. Because the plural marriage was not valid in law, the court finally held she had never legally been his wife, and so no divorce could be granted and no alimony could be owed. In the narrow terms of the courtroom, Brigham Young won. He paid her nothing in the end. But by the time that ruling came down, the courtroom had long since ceased to be the real battlefield, because Anne Eliza had taken her story out of the courts and onto the stage, and there she was winning in a way no dismissal could touch. There is an eerie, closed quality to the world she described, and it is worth entering carefully and on her terms, remembering that hers is one voice and an angry one. What she carried to the public was the interior of a sealed religious order, a household of dozens of wives arranged around one man, bound by rituals the outside world never saw, governed by a doctrine that made a wife one of many and taught her to call it holy. She spoke of loneliness inside a crowd of sister wives, of a sense of being owned rather than loved, of a system that she said reduced women to a kind of spiritual property. We should be fair and say that this is her interpretation, the account of a woman who had come to hate the life and had every reason to paint it dark, and that many women in that world described their lives very differently. But we should also grant that she had lived it, that she spoke from the inside of a thing almost no outsider could see, and that the picture she drew of a woman erased inside a patriarch's household struck a nerve in the country precisely because it rang true to the age's deepest anxieties about where such power could lead. She had turned the most intimate knowledge a person can hold, the knowledge of a marriage, into testimony against the man who ruled a church. The country devoured it. Here was a story that gathered up every anxiety the age carried about the strange kingdom in the desert, and gave it a human face, a young woman's face, and a voice that spoke plain American grievance rather than doctrine. The newspapers that had thundered against polygamy in the abstract for years suddenly had a flesh and blood plaintiff, a runaway wife naming names and asking a court for money, and they made her a sensation. And the enemies of the church, in the government and out of it, understood at once what a gift she was. For decades, the practice of plural marriage had been argued as a question of theology and of states' rights and of religious freedom, a fog of principle in which the church could always find cover. Anne Eliza Young dragged it down out of the fog and onto the ground of a divorce court, where it became a simple and devastating question that any citizen could grasp. Was this woman a wife, or was she not? And if she was, what did that make the prophet? And if she was not, what did that make the marriages at the heart of his religion? The image that the whole nation carried away from the case was the image of the prophet humbled. Brigham Young, master of a territory, believed by his people to speak for heaven, refused the court's order to support the wife who had left him, and for that refusal, the machinery of ordinary American law reached up and held him in contempt, and sentenced him, the ruler of Utah, to a day in a cell and a fine of $25. The sum meant nothing to a man of his wealth. The picture meant everything to a watching country. A judge had made the living prophet answer, and he had been made to look, for a moment, like any other husband dragged before the law by a wife he had wronged. The eventual dismissal of the case years later, on the ground that the plural marriage had never been legal, and so she had never truly been a wife, was a narrow victory that came far too late to repair the damage, and it carried its own poison, because to escape paying her, he had to let the courts declare that his sacred wives were, in the eye of the law, not wives at all. The fight over money inside the case became its own kind of scandal, because it forced the prophet to argue, in open court, that he was far poorer than the world believed. Anne Eliza's side put his worth at some $8 million, with an income of $40,000 a month and more, an enormous figure meant to establish that the man could easily afford to keep the wife he had cast off. Brigham Young's side answered by shrinking him. His true worth, they insisted, was under $600,000, his income under $6,000 a month, a modest competence for a man with a household the size of a village to maintain. A contemporary estimate put his real property nearer $2 million. The exact truth was buried in the tangle where his own fortune ran together with the wealth of the church he led, and it could not be cleanly separated. But the spectacle itself was the point, and it was delicious to his enemies. The living prophet, the man his people believed spoke for God, was reduced to haggling in a courtroom over the size of his purse, pleading comparative poverty to avoid paying the runaway wife a monthly allowance. Whatever the real number, the sight of it dragged him down to the scale of an ordinary rich man caught in an ordinary divorce, which was itself a kind of exposure no sermon could repair. And she had discovered, in the ruin of her marriage, something the prophet could not confiscate and could not answer. He could refuse her the alimony. He could win the legal point. He could not stop her from talking. And talking, it turned out, paid better than alimony ever would, and reached further than any courtroom. While the suit crawled toward its dismissal, Anne Eliza Young stepped onto a lecture platform, and the runaway wife became a national performer, carrying the story of her bondage from the desert all the way to the ear of the President of the United States. Chapter 10. The Lecture That Reached the President. With her lawsuit still winding through the courts, Anne Eliza Young turned her marriage into a paying act, hired a celebrated lecture agent, and carried the story of her life inside the prophet's household, from the desert of Utah to a hall in Washington, where the President of the United States sat in the audience, listening. The lecture had a title she used like a banner, My Life in Bondage, and she took it on the road under the management of a famous impresario of the platform, one of the men who made stars of lecturers in an age when a great speaker could fill a hall in every city in the land. And fill them she did. She spoke in Denver and Chicago, in Boston and beyond, to packed and paying houses, curious Americans who wanted to see with their own eyes the woman who had fled the most notorious marriage in the country and lived to tell it. By one count, she delivered well over 200 lectures in little more than a year, some of them for as much as $1,000 a night, and she was said to have cleared more than $20,000 in a single season. The wife who could not collect $1 of alimony was earning a fortune by telling the country why, and in 1875 she put it all between covers in a memoir with a title built to sell, Wife Number 19. Promising the reader a complete exposure of the hidden life of polygamy and the sufferings of the women caught in it. The tour did more than make her rich and famous. It reached, at its height, the very top of the government. In the spring of 1874, she testified before the Congress of the United States, and she gave a lecture in Washington that was attended by President Ulysses Grant himself, together with the First Lady. Try to see it as the country saw it. A runaway plural wife standing on a lit stage in the Capitol, telling the story of her escape from the most powerful patriarch in the West, with the President of the Republic seated among the listeners. That single image is the whole of her power compressed into one scene, the private grievance of one woman raised up until it commanded the attention of the head of state, and the attention translated into law. That same year, in June of 1874, President Grant signed a measure known as the Poland Act, which stripped the church of its control over the courts of Utah, moving that power into the hands of federal officers. It was one link in a long chain of federal pressure that would tighten over the following years through the courts and through further acts of Congress, until the church at last, in 1890, gave up the practice of plural marriage. Historians rightly caution that Anne Eliza Young did not single-handedly cause any of these laws, that vast forces were pushing the same way. But she gave the cause a face and a voice. She put the private suffering of women at the center of a debate that had been about doctrine and politics. And she reached the ear of a president in the very season the pressure began to bite. Her testimony and her tour ran just ahead of the law, and the law moved in her direction. The church answered her the way the powerful always answered these women, with the full weight of the institution. She was excommunicated in the autumn of 1874, cast out of the faith she had been born into. And the collapse to a single image in her story is not a locked door or a rope of women, but a printed poster, the kind that papered the front of a lecture hall, bearing the title of her act and, above it, her own name printed large. For the first time in her life, her name was bigger than the church she had fled. The woman who had been one entry on a list of dozens of wives had made herself, for a few bright years, larger than the institution that had tried to absorb her. The brightness did not last, and her later life reads like a slow fading out. Brigham Young died in the summer of 1877, and with him gone, the appetite for her story began to cool. She married again, a Michigan lumberman, in 1883, and that marriage too ended in divorce a decade later. She brought out a revised version of her book in 1908, reaching for an audience that had mostly moved on. And then she seemed simply to vanish. For a long time, no one even knew where or when she had died, and a legend grew up that she had ended in poverty and been buried in a pauper's grave, the runaway wife swallowed at last by obscurity. Only much later did patient researchers trace her final years through the census records of the West and establish the truth that she died in December of 1917 in Sparks, Nevada, of pneumonia, and was buried in Reno. The obscurity was real, but it was not the melodrama the legend imagined. She had simply outlived her fame and slipped quietly out of the country's memory, which is its own kind of ending for a woman who had once commanded the attention of a president. She did not carry the fight alone, and the allies she gathered tell you how far her story reached beyond her own grievance. The leading reformers of the day took her up. Her memoir went out into the world with introductions from famous voices of the temperance and women's movements, respectable crusaders who lent their names to the runaway wife, and framed her private ordeal as a public cause. What might have been dismissed as one bitter woman's complaint became, with their backing, a document in a national argument, and her lecture became a stop that reformers and the curious alike felt they ought to attend. She had turned the most intimate wound a person can carry, the failure of a marriage, into a paying, travelling, respectable indictment of a whole way of life. And she had done it as a woman with no property, no vote, and no standing but the standing her own voice could earn her from a lit stage. The legal change she helped set in motion ran on long after her fame had faded, and it ended in the surrender of the very practice she had exposed. The Poland Act that President Grant signed in the season of her Washington lectures was only the first link. In the years that followed came a ruling of the Supreme Court against a Mormon man who had claimed plural marriage as a religious right, and then further and harsher acts of Congress that stripped the church of its property and its political power and disenfranchised those who practiced polygamy, until the pressure grew so great that the church, in 1890, formally gave up plural marriage altogether. Historians are right to insist that Anne Eliza Young did not accomplish this by herself, that she was one force among many great ones. But she had put a woman's suffering at the center of the story at the moment the story caught fire. She had reached the president in the very season the federal campaign began to bite, and she had given a face and a voice to a cause that had been, before her, a matter of dry doctrine and distant politics. That is a great deal for one runaway wife to have done. Set her beside the others, and the escalation is plain. She had reached higher than Madeleine Pollard, who unmade one career, higher than Victoria Woodhull, who broke one idol, higher even than Nellie Bly, who shamed institutions. Anne Eliza Young had helped bend the law of the United States against a whole religious empire, and had done it with a lawsuit, a lecture, and a book, the tools of a woman with no other power. But there was one fortress larger than a church, larger than any single institution, the largest concentration of private wealth the world had ever produced. And the woman who would bring it down was, at that very moment, a girl growing up in the oil country of Pennsylvania, watching her own father be quietly ruined by it, and remembering. Chapter 11. The Oil Town, Standard Oil Ruined. Ida Tarbell was a girl in the oil country of Pennsylvania in the year a secret arrangement between the railroads and one hungry refiner began, very quietly, to strangle every small producer her father knew. And the memory of that ruin would wait patiently inside her for 30 years before it came out as the most consequential act of journalism in American history. She was born in 1857 in a corner of northwestern Pennsylvania, into the raw, muddy, booming world of the first American oil rush. Her father, Franklin Tarbell, was a man of that world, a builder of the wooden tanks that held the crude, and then a small producer and refiner himself, one of the thousands of independent oil men who had rushed into the region when the ground first gave up its black wealth. It was a hard life and a hopeful one, a country of derricks and boom towns where an ordinary man with nerve could make something of himself. And then, when Ida was a girl of about 15, something happened to that world that she never forgot and never forgave. In 1872, a scheme surfaced, a secret understanding between the great railroads and a combination of large refiners called the South Improvement Company that would have handed the favored few a crushing advantage. The railroads would charge the big insiders lower rates and, more poisonous still, would pay them a cut out of the higher rates charged to their competitors. It was a machine designed to reward the powerful for the very shipments their rivals made, and it fell on the independent oil men of the region like a death sentence. The oil country rose in fury against it, and Franklin Tarbell rose with them. There were mass meetings and marches, and men rolled Standard Oil tank cars off the rails and let the oil run into the ground in their rage. The scheme itself was beaten back, but the deeper thing it revealed did not go away, and neither did the man behind so much of it. The independents her father knew were, one by one, worn down, bought out, or broken, and the great combination kept growing, absorbing the region's oil into a single vast machine. Ida Tarbell grew up watching honest, striving men defeated by something they could not see and could not fight. A power that worked through secret contracts and hidden rates rather than in the open. And she grew up with a cold, lasting sense that a wrong had been done, and that no one had ever made the wrongdoers answer for it. She was not content to be an ornament, and the age made that difficult. She went to college, to Allegheny, entering in 1876 as the only woman in a class of 41 young men. And she took her degree, and later a further degree, and she set out to make her living by her mind. She taught for a time, then turned to writing, working for years on a magazine of the improving sort. And then, hungry for something larger, she went to Paris to study and to write. It was there that she was found by Samuel McClure, the restless genius who was building a new kind of magazine back in New York, cheap enough for ordinary people and serious enough to matter. And in 1894, she joined the staff of McClure's magazine at $3,000 a year. She made her name first with a long, careful, popular study of the life of Abraham Lincoln that nearly doubled the magazine's circulation and proved she could hold a mass audience across many issues. By the end of the century, she was a desk editor at $5,000 a year with a share in the company. One of the most respected working writers in America, a woman who had climbed by sheer patient competence into the front rank of a man's profession. The oil country of her childhood was a place of sudden wealth and sudden ruin, a muddy, roaring frontier of wooden derricks and boom towns thrown up overnight wherever the ground gave up its crude. Men made fortunes and lost them in a season, and the whole region ran on a rough, hopeful faith that the game, however hard, was open to anyone willing to work and to gamble. That faith was what the South Improvement Scheme betrayed, and that betrayal was what the child Ida absorbed and never released. She was old enough to understand the talk at her father's table, old enough to feel the fear come into a striving household when the news of the secret rates broke, old enough to watch grown men she respected go from confidence to defeat. What she learned was not merely that her father had been hurt, it was that he had been hurt by something hidden, a machine of secret contracts he could neither see nor fight, run by men who never had to show their faces or answer for their methods. A wrong done in the open can at least be met. A wrong done in the dark, by a power that will not admit it exists, festers into a lifelong sense that the world is rigged and that no one will ever be made to answer. That sense was the seed. She refused the ordinary path a woman of her time was handed, and the refusal cost her and defined her. She would not simply marry and disappear into a household. She wanted work of the mind, and she went and got it, at a time when a woman who did so was an oddity to be remarked upon, the lone female in a college lecture hall full of young men. She taught, she wrote, she edited, and hungry for something larger than the improving little magazine that first employed her, she took herself off to Paris to study and to write. It was there that Samuel McClure found her, the whirlwind of a publisher who was inventing a new kind of magazine back in America, one that would take serious subjects and put them, cheaply and vividly, into the hands of millions of ordinary readers. She joined him, and she proved with her long study of the life of Lincoln that she could hold that vast new audience across issue after issue, patient, accurate, and gripping. She had built herself, without a fortune or a husband or a vote, into one of the most trusted writers in the country. And she had built, in the doing, the exact instrument a reckoning would require. The magazine that gave her the chance was itself something new under the sun. Samuel McClure had grasped that the new presses and the new reading public had created an appetite no one was feeding, an appetite among ordinary Americans for serious, truthful, gripping accounts of how their country actually worked. And he gathered around him a staff of writers willing to go and find out. When the editors cast about for the greatest subject their new kind of journalism could take on, they settled on the largest and most feared business combination in the history of the world. And they needed a writer equal to it. Someone who could master an ocean of documents and turn it into a story a shopkeeper's wife would read to the end. There was one obvious choice. Ida Tarbell had the patience, proven across her long biographical series. And she had the fluency. And she had, though the editors valued it less than they should have, the one thing that would drive her through 2 grinding years of research, a grievance that reached back to her own childhood. She had watched this power ruin her father's world. Now she was being handed the assignment of her life to find out exactly how it had been done and to tell the whole country. She took it, and she went to work with the quiet ferocity of a person who has waited 30 years for the chance. And all the while, underneath the respectability and the success, the old grievance sat waiting. She had spent her career learning exactly how to do one thing better than almost anyone alive: how to research a subject exhaustively, how to gather documents and testimony and public records, and assemble them into a narrative a general reader could follow and believe. She had built, without quite meaning to, the perfect instrument for a reckoning. There was one subject she understood in her bones, one power whose rise she had watched from the mud of the oil country as a child, one machine that had ruined the men of her father's generation and never been called to account for it. When McClure's went looking for its next great subject, the largest and most feared business combination in the history of the world, Ida Tarbell was the one person in American letters who had both the grievance and the skill. And she knew it. She was going to do to Standard Oil the one thing no one had ever done. She was going to make it explain itself. Chapter 12. 2 years of his own records. In 1901, Ida Tarbell sat down to do a thing that sounds almost modest and was in fact revolutionary, to simply document, page by patient page and year by year, exactly how the greatest fortune in the world had actually been built. She did not set out to write a denunciation. She set out to write a history, and that discipline is the whole secret of why it worked. For close to 2 years, she gathered everything: the public records and the court testimony, the state and federal investigations, the pamphlets and the price lists and the railroad schedules, the long paper trail that even a secretive empire leaves behind it when it does business across a continent. She interviewed men who had been inside the machine, most remarkably one of Standard Oil's own senior directors, a man named Henry Rogers, who agreed to talk with her and answer her questions, apparently confident that a lady writer could do his company no real harm. She read and cross-checked and organized, and slowly, out of the mountain of evidence, she assembled a portrait of the thing that no advertisement or apology could wave away, because every damning stroke of it was drawn from the record. What the record showed was a method, applied with genius and without mercy over 30 years. At the heart of it lay the same weapon that had ruined her father's world: the secret railroad rebate, the hidden discount that let the great combination ship its oil for far less than any rival could. And the drawback, the still darker device by which the railroads paid the combination a cut out of the money its competitors paid to ship their own oil. A rival, in other words, could be made to help fund the very machine that was crushing him, and often did not even know it. She documented the fake competitors, the supposedly independent oil firms that were secretly owned and controlled by the combination, used to lure customers and gather intelligence and destroy the genuine independence from within. And she documented the spying. She showed that the company had, in effect, built a private secret service, that it paid clerks and shippers to report on the movements of rival oil, that orders placed with competitors were quietly cancelled, that rail cars carrying a rival's product were sidetracked and delayed. One story out of her account has lived on above all the others, and honesty compels the note that it comes to us through Tarbell herself, from a source she protected. A young clerk in a Standard Oil office, ordered to burn a stack of company records, saw on one of the papers the name of his own Sunday school teacher, an independent oilman, and understood in a flash that the firm he worked for was secretly tracking and destroying the businesses of decent men he knew. And he gathered up the incriminating papers and carried them to Ida Tarbell. Whether every detail of that scene is exact, it stands for the thing her whole method proved, that the machine ran on secrets, and that secrets, once carried into the light, could not be unseen. The scale of the man at the center of it strains belief even now, and Tarbell laid it out so a reader could feel it. John D. Rockefeller had built, out of the chaos of the oil rush, a combination that at its height controlled the overwhelming majority of the refining of oil in the United States, and through it he had gathered to himself a fortune with no equal in the modern world. In the years of her writing, he was reckoned to be worth on the order of $900 million, a sum that came to something near 3% of the entire American economy of the day. One man holding in his own hands a slice of the national wealth that no private person had ever held before, or has held since. By the measures of a later generation, he would be called the first American billionaire, and, adjusted across the long arc of prices and growth, the richest human being who has ever lived. That was the fortress Ida Tarbell had decided to document, the largest concentration of private wealth in the history of the world, ruled by a man who had never in his life been made to answer a hostile question in public. The labor of it was immense, and the labor was the point. She was not writing from memory or from grievance, whatever fire her grievance lit. She was building a case the way a great prosecutor builds one, out of documents that could be checked, testimony that had been given under oath, figures that appeared in the public record, so that every charge she made rested on something a reader could, in principle, go and verify. For close to 2 years, she lived inside that record, traveling, reading, corresponding, cross-checking one account against another, teaching herself the tangled history of a business that had gone to great lengths to keep its history hidden. And slowly, the shape of the machine emerged from the paper, clean and terrible, and it emerged in the one form that could not be dismissed as the envy of a rival or the spite of the ruined, the form of documented fact. Feel what the drawback actually meant, because it is the coldest thing in the whole story. The rebate was ugly enough, the secret discount that let the great combination ship its oil for less than any rival could. But the drawback went further into cruelty than that. Under it, the railroads paid the combination a cutout of the money its competitors paid to move their own oil. A small independent refiner, shipping his product, was made to pour a portion of his own freight money into the pocket of the giant that was crushing him, and often he did not even know it was happening. He was funding his own execution. Tarbell laid this out so plainly that any reader could feel the outrage of it, and she went on to document the rest of the method with the same care, the fake independents secretly owned by the combination and used to lure and betray real ones, the paid informers, the orders to competitors mysteriously cancelled, the rail cars of a rival's oil quietly sidetracked to spoil and delay. And she set beside it the scale of what the method had built, a combination that at its height controlled the great majority of all the oil refined in the United States, and a personal fortune for the man at its head that ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars and came to a slice of the entire national wealth that no private person had ever held. The bigness was not the crime. The means were the crime, and she proved the means. The strangest turn in the whole investigation was the help she got from inside the fortress itself. One of Standard Oil's own senior men, a director named Henry Rogers, agreed to sit with her and answer her questions, meeting her over many months. He was a charming, formidable man, and he seems to have believed that by talking to her, he could shape what she wrote, that a courteous insider could steer a lady journalist toward a softer account. He was mistaken about the woman across the table. Everything he told her she checked against the record, and everything the record confirmed she used, and the intimacy of his cooperation only sharpened the precision of the portrait she drew. It is one of the quiet ironies of the story that the combination's own director helped the woman who fixed its founder's reputation for a century. And through it all, she kept a scrupulous fairness that made the indictment heavier, not lighter. She granted the combination its genuine efficiencies, acknowledged the real order it had brought to a chaotic trade, gave Rockefeller his due as an organizer of rare and ruthless genius. That fairness was armor. It meant that when she turned to the rebates and the drawbacks and the spying, no one could say she was a hater blind to the good, because she had already, in her own pages, admitted the good. She had built a case so balanced that its condemnation could not be shrugged off. She published it not as a bomb, but as a series, 19 long installments, running in McClure's magazine from the autumn of 1902 across the next 2 years, and then gathered into a 2-volume book at the end of 1904. Month after month, in every issue, another patient, devastating chapter of the true history reached a mass audience of ordinary Americans, the very people whose towns and trades had been shaped by the thing she was describing. There was no hysteria in it, no name-calling, no shrill demand. There was only the record, marshalled with such care and such completeness that it could not be denied, and the cumulative effect of it was to change, permanently, how the American public saw the richest man among them. She had not shouted, she had documented, and the documentation was the one form of attack against which all his money and all his lawyers had no defense, because you cannot sue a fact, and you cannot buy back a record once a nation has read it. The only question left was how the great man would answer her, and the answer he chose was the one thing that could not save him. Chapter 13. The richest man said nothing. John D. Rockefeller, the wealthiest man alive and very possibly the wealthiest who had ever lived, met the most dangerous account ever written of him with the single strategy that could not work. He refused to say a word. It was, in a way, entirely in character. He was a private man, controlled, pious, certain of his own rightness, a man who had spent his life letting his results speak and treating public explanation as beneath him. He would not dignify the woman's articles with a reply. In private, he let his contempt show, calling her that misguided woman and that poisonous woman, and mocking her with a schoolyard twist on her name, Miss Tarbarrel. To those around him who wanted to answer her, to issue rebuttals and mount a defense, he gave the instruction that sealed his fate. Not a word, he told them. Not a word about that misguided woman. He believed his silence was strength. He believed that to answer was to admit that a mere magazine writer could touch him, and that a man of his standing simply did not stoop to it. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong is the reason this whole story exists. Silence is a defense against opinion. It is no defense at all against a documented fact, because the fact does not need his participation to be true, and his refusal to engage it read to a watching nation, not as dignity, but as an inability to deny what she had proven. And Tarbell, having laid out the machine across so many patient installments, closed her great work with something more intimate and more damning still, a study of the man himself. She turned her documentary gaze on Rockefeller the person, and she drew a portrait that fixed him in the American mind for good. She described a man aged and strange, calling him the oldest man in the world, a living mummy, an image of a soul withered by the very pursuit that had made him rich. And she delivered a verdict on him that has outlived every stock certificate he ever signed. Our national life, she wrote, is on every side distinctly poorer, uglier, meaner, for the kind of influence he exercises. It was not a wild charge or a slur. It was the considered conclusion of the one person in America who had studied his methods more closely than anyone. And coming after the mountain of evidence she had already laid down, it landed with the force of a proven thing. The public tide turned, and it turned hard, and the machinery of the state at last began to move in the direction her readers were pushing it. The pressure that had been building for years, of which her work was now the loudest and most credible part, translated into action. The federal government brought its power to bear on the combination, and in 1906, the Congress passed a law strengthening the government's hand over the railroads and their secret rates, the very rebates and drawbacks she had exposed, and the antitrust suit against the Great Trust went forward. It climbed, over the following years, all the way to the highest court in the land, and in 1911, the Supreme Court of the United States found that the Standard Oil combination had violated the nation's antitrust law and ordered the thing that had seemed for a generation to be beyond the reach of any power on earth. It ordered the empire broken apart, dissolved into 34 separate companies. He was not alone at the top of that magazine, and the company he kept there tells you what kind of moment it was. McClure's had become the flagship of a whole movement of writers who turned the new mass press against the powerful, the men and women a later president would half-mockingly call the muckrakers, the rakers of filth. Beside Tarbell, on the masthead, sat writers exposing the corruption of the cities and the abuses of labor, and together they were teaching the American public a new habit, the habit of looking behind the marble facades of the age at the machinery that ran them. Tarbell disliked the name muckraker because she was not raking filth for sport. She was doing history, and her Standard Oil series was the movement's masterpiece, the proof that patient documentation aimed at a single great target could move a nation. Month after month, in issue after issue, another chapter of the true story reached the very readers whose lives the trust had shaped. And month after month, the public mind hardened until the pressure had nowhere to go but into the law, and the law, at last, moved. The government that had circled the great combination for years, unable to land a blow, now had what it had always lacked, a case laid out in the open where every citizen could read it. In 1906, the Congress strengthened the government's power over the railroads and their secret rates, striking at the very rebates and drawbacks she had exposed. And the antitrust suit against the trust went forward and began its long climb through the courts. The reforms she helped set loose would run on for years beyond the breakup, into new antitrust laws and a new federal commission built to watch over exactly the kind of power she had anatomized. Rockefeller, through all of it, kept to his silence and his piety, pouring his fortune into universities and foundations and good works, as though enough visible charity might buy back the name her articles had taken from him. It bought a great deal. It did not buy that. The portrait she had drawn, of the cold builder who never played fair, had gone too deep into the public mind to be painted over. The character study that closed her series deserves a second look because it shows how completely she understood that the man's own strategy had handed her the victory. Rockefeller had chosen to be a mystery, a silent, veiled figure who let others guess at him, and Tarbell simply filled the silence he left with a portrait drawn from the record and from long observation. And because he would not offer a competing picture of himself, hers became the only picture there was. She described a man remote and strange, aged beyond his years by the endless getting, and she reached for an image that has never let him go. The oldest man in the world, a living mummy, a soul dried out by the very fortune that made him a god of business. It was a devastating thing to write, and it was devastating precisely because it did not read as spite. It read as the sober verdict of the one person who had studied him hardest, and coming after volumes of proof, the reader believed it. A titan who had never in his life been made to answer a hostile question found that his refusal to answer had left a woman free to define him to the whole nation, and the definition stuck fast. And the readers did the rest. Month after month, the installments went out to towns and farms and city tenements across the country. And month after month, the ordinary reader's sense of the richest man among them curdled and hardened, until a public that had once regarded Rockefeller with a kind of awe regarded him instead with a cold and settled suspicion. That shift in millions of private minds was the true engine of everything that followed, because in a country that still, however imperfectly, answered to its people, a public that had turned against a power was a public whose government would eventually turn against it too. She had not passed a law or filed a suit. She had done the deeper thing that makes laws and suits possible. She had changed what the country believed. Hold that moment, because it is the peak of everything these 5 women did, and you should feel the size of it. A generation earlier, the idea that anyone, let alone a woman with no office and no fortune and no vote, could bring the law down on the greatest business empire the world had ever seen would have been a fantasy. The trust had beaten rivals, beaten states, beaten every reformer who came at it head-on, precisely because its true workings were hidden and no one could prove them. And a woman from the ruined oil country, armed with nothing but 2 years of patient research and a magazine that reached the common reader, had made those hidden workings visible to the whole nation, and the visibility was the thing the empire could not survive. The breakup was executed by prosecutors and by judges, and it is only fair to say so plainly, because Ida Tarbell never claimed to have done it alone. But it was her work that turned an abstract public unease into a specific, documented, undeniable case that gave the reformers their evidence and the public its conviction, and without the case she built, the fortress might have stood for another generation. The richest man in the history of the world had chosen silence, and silence had let the truth stand unopposed until it toppled him. Chapter 14. What a pen could not take. When the Supreme Court ordered Standard Oil broken into 34 pieces, the pieces did not make John D. Rockefeller poorer. They made him, on paper, the richest he had ever been in his life, and it was still the worst defeat he ever suffered. The irony is almost too neat, and it is entirely true. When the Great Trust was dissolved, Rockefeller held enormous shares in every one of the 34 companies it became, and those new stocks, freed to trade on their own, rose and rose until his paper fortune swelled past anything the intact empire had been worth. By the time of his death in 1937, he was reckoned to be worth well over $1 billion, a figure that, measured against the size of the economy of his day, made him almost certainly the wealthiest American who has ever lived. Ida Tarbell had not taken his money. That was never within her power, and she never imagined it was. What she had taken was something he valued in a different way and could never buy back. And to see what that was, you have to understand what a man like Rockefeller wanted from the world once he had all the money in it. He wanted to be seen as good. He wanted the philanthropy and the piety and the Sunday school to be the story. And after Ida Tarbell, they never quite were. She had fixed him forever as the cold architect of the rebate and the drawback, the man who built the greatest fortune on earth by never once playing fair. The money grew. the name did not recover. For Tarbell herself, the great work made her the most famous investigative journalist in America, and the very model of what a woman with a pen could do to a man with an empire. And it is one of the quiet surprises of her life that she was never entirely comfortable in the role. She resisted the label that attached to her and her colleagues, the muckrakers, disliking the suggestion that she raked filth for its own sake. And she insisted, to the end of her long life, on a distinction that tells you everything about the kind of enemy she was, and why she was so much more dangerous than a mere hater of the rich. She had nothing against wealth, she said, and nothing against a company growing as large as it could. Her whole quarrel was with the lie, with the unfair means, with the cheating. Late in her life, she set it down in the plainest words, and they are the truest summary of the whole spirit that runs through all 5 of these women. "I never had an animus against their size and wealth," she wrote. "I was willing that they should combine and grow as big and rich as they could, but only by legitimate means." And then the sentence that lands like a closing door. "They had never played fair, and that ruined their greatness for me. That is the heart of it." She did not envy the fortress. She only refused to pretend it was honest. She had watched, as a girl, decent men defeated by a hidden hand, and she had spent 2 years proving the hidden hand was real, and she asked of the greatest power in the country the one thing it had spent its whole existence avoiding, that it play by the same rules as everyone else, or at least be seen clearly for not doing so. She went on writing and working for decades more, published the story of her own life in 1939 when she was past 80, and died in the winter of 1944 at the age of 86. Long after her death, when scholars gathered to rank the great works of American journalism of the century, her history of Standard Oil stood near the very top of the list, a monument built entirely out of other men's records. Put the numbers in a row, and you can feel why the money could never be the wound. In the years of her great series, he was already reckoned at something near $900 million, a sum that came to roughly 3% of the whole American economy of the day. One man holding a slice of the national wealth that no private person had ever held. By the time he died, decades later, after the breakup his enemies had won, his fortune had swelled past $1 billion, and measured across the long arc of prices and growth, he stands as very likely the richest human being who has ever lived. You could take from a man like that a monopoly, a company, a market, even a Supreme Court case, and leave him wealthier than any king. There was only one thing you could take from him that he could never earn back, and it did not sit in any vault. You have watched 4 women reach the thing their men most feared to lose, and now, at the summit, you can see it plainly for what it is. It is the story the world tells about a man. Rockefeller wanted, once he had all the money, to be remembered as good, and he spent the second half of his life and a fortune trying to purchase that memory. Ida Tarbell, with 19 articles and 2 years of records, had put a different memory in its place, and it held. She herself went on for decades, uneasy in the role of crusader, forever insisting she was no wild radical, that she had never begrudged any man his riches, only his lying. When the scholars of a later century sat down to rank the greatest works of American journalism of the whole 100 years, they placed her history of Standard Oil near the very summit of the list, 5th among them all, a monument built entirely out of one powerful man's own records. She had proven, once and for all, that the largest fortune ever made could be answered, if only someone had the patience to read. The reforms she helped set loose outlived her and reshaped the country. The exposure of the secret railroad rates fed directly into the laws that reined the railroads in. and the case against the trust that her work had made possible was followed, in the years after the breakup, by a whole new architecture of restraint, fresh antitrust law, and a new federal commission built to watch over exactly the kind of concentrated power she had anatomized. A single woman's patient reading of the record had helped bend the machinery of the national government against the largest fortune it had ever contained, and the guardrails she helped erect stood long after both she and Rockefeller were gone. She had, in the most literal sense, changed the rules of the game she had watched destroy her father's world. And she carried the whole meaning of it in a handful of words that refuse every easy reading of her as a mere enemy of the rich. She had no quarrel with wealth. She insisted to the end. No objection to a company growing as great as it honestly could. Her quarrel was only ever with the cheating, the secret and unfair means by which the greatest fortune of the age had been assembled, and she said so plainly, insisting that she had never begrudged any combination its size or its riches, so long as it grew by honest means. That is the whole spirit of it, the thing that made her and all these women so much more dangerous than ordinary rebels. They did not want to tear down the powerful for being powerful. They wanted the powerful to be seen exactly as they were, and it turned out that being seen clearly was the one thing the fortress could not survive. And here the story circles back to where it began, to the image in the very first minutes of this telling, one woman at a desk, the index cards and the court transcript stacked around her, quietly assembling the case that the richest man on earth could not answer. That is the picture to keep. Not a mob, not a bomb, not a gun, a desk, a stack of records, and a patience that outlasted a fortune. Rockefeller had built the highest wall any private man ever built, and he had left, at the back of it, the same unlocked door every one of these men left. The belief that the truth about him could be kept in the dark forever, because the only people who held it would never be believed or heard. Ida Tarbell walked through that door with a lamp made of paper, and once the light was in, no amount of money could put it out. Chapter 15. The men kept only the money. Set the 5 of them side by side at the end, and a pattern rises out of the 5 separate stories that none of them, alone, could have seen, because each of these women paid almost the entire price of her victory herself, while the man she beat kept nearly everything but the one thing she had come for. Look at the ledger honestly, because the age would have hidden it, and we should not. Madeline Pollard won her verdict and never saw a dollar of the $15,000 the jury awarded, and she left the country and disappeared into a foreign city rather than live out her days as America's most famous fallen woman. Victoria Woodhull broke the most beloved preacher in the nation and was rewarded with a jail cell on election day, financial ruin, and an exile across an ocean, remaking herself into a respectable Englishwoman because respectability at home was closed to her forever. Nellie Bly cracked an asylum and disgraced a fixer and circled the earth and died of pneumonia with almost nothing, her fortune embezzled out from under her. Anne Eliza Young reached the ear of a president and helped bend federal law against an empire, and faded into an obscurity so total that for decades the world did not know the year of her death. Even Ida Tarbell, the most respectable and the most triumphant of them all, spent the rest of her life gently correcting the record, insisting she was no wild radical, carrying the private ache of a grievance that went back to her father's ruin. Now look at the men. Rockefeller died the richest American who ever lived. Brigham Young died the master of his church, mourned by tens of thousands, his empire intact and his faith enduring to this day. Beecher kept his pulpit and his fame and his lecture fees until the end of his life. Breckinridge lost his seat, which is the most any of them lost, and even he simply went home to Kentucky and lived out his years, never paying the woman a cent of what he owed her. Measured in money and in comfort, the men mostly won. If this were only a story about money, it would be a bleak one, a catalogue of women who threw themselves against fortresses and shattered while the fortresses stood. There is a temptation, looking at that ledger, to read it as simple defeat, and it is worth resisting the temptation, because it misreads what these women were actually playing for. They did not go into their fights expecting to end rich or safe or celebrated. Most of them had already lost the things the age taught a woman to protect before they ever spoke: the good name, the marriage, the place in respectable society. That was precisely what freed them. A woman with nothing left to guard is the most dangerous witness a powerful man can face because the ordinary threats have no purchase on her. You cannot ruin a woman who is already ruined. You cannot silence with shame a woman who has already been shamed and has decided to stop hiding. Each of these 5 had passed through the fire the age used to keep women quiet, and had come out the other side with the one freedom the age never meant to give them, the freedom of having nothing more to lose. And then the age did the last thing it could do to them. It forgot them. This is the quiet, final injustice that runs under all 5 stories, and it is why so many of these names may be new to you tonight. The men are remembered. Rockefeller's name is on universities and foundations. Beecher fills the histories of American religion. Brigham Young has a city and a university bearing his name. Even Breckinridge keeps his place in the long roll of the family's senators and generals. The women who brought these men to account slipped one after another out of the story, into foreign cities and rented rooms and unmarked years, until a runaway wife who had once commanded the attention of a president could die in a Nevada town with the world unsure she had ever existed. The fortresses kept their monuments. The women who breached them were allowed to disappear. That erasure was not an accident of the record. It was the last move the age had left, and it very nearly worked. And there is a harder question hiding inside the ledger, the question of whether it was worth it, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. If Madeleine Pollard could have seen, from the witness stand, the foreign exile and the forgotten grave that waited for her, would she have sued? If Victoria Woodhull had known the jail cell and the ruin, would she have printed? The age would have told them no, would have told each of them to keep her head down and take what small safety silence could buy. But look at what silence would have bought, and the calculation changes. Silence would have left a congressman free to use and discard the next girl and the one after her. Silence would have left a preacher's hypocrisy to rot quietly behind his halo. Silence would have kept the asylum doors swinging shut on the poor, kept a wife's suffering a private matter, kept the richest man on earth beyond every question. Each of these women weighed her own ruin against that silence, and each of them chose to speak, and the country they left was, in some measurable way, less cruel for the choice. Whether it was worth it to her is a question only each woman could answer. Whether it was worth it to us is not in doubt. But money was never what these women took, and money was never what these men most feared to lose. What every one of these stories turns on is something the age valued above cash and hid more carefully than gold: the good name, the shining public face, the legend. That was the true architecture of Gilded Age power, and it is the deepest thing these 5 lives reveal. The fortune was only the foundation, the thing built on top of it, the thing the Titan actually lived for, was the story the world told about him, the preacher's holiness, the prophet's divine authority, the orator's honor, the philanthropist's goodness. And that, the story, was the one possession that lived out in the open, in the minds of millions, where a single woman with a single true sentence could reach it. She could not touch the money in the vault. She could walk right up to the legend and pull it down. And once it was down, all the money in the vault could not stand it back up. The men had built their strongholds on the certainty that the people who knew their secrets, the wives and the mistresses, the seduced and the institutionalized and the ruined, were people the world had agreed in advance never to believe. Every one of these women proved that certainty was a lie, and in proving it, took from these men the only thing they could not replace. Chapter 16. The one door, no fortune locked. It still happens in every institution built on the quiet certainty that the people best placed to expose it will never be believed. And that is why 5 women who never met and who have been half forgotten still have something urgent to say to us tonight. Think again of the fortresses and of how alike they were beneath their different flags. A congressman wrapped in a founding family's name believed a ruined girl could be used and discarded because who would ever take her word over his? A preacher, adored by millions, believed his secret was safe because who would ever believe it of him? A network of doctors and officials believed the poor women in their wards could be warehoused forever because who listens to the mad and the destitute? A prophet at the head of a church and a territory believed his household was beyond the reach of any law because who could touch a man who spoke for God? And the richest man in the history of the world believed his methods could stay hidden behind his money forever because who could ever prove what happened inside the machine? 5 strongholds, 5 certainties, and every certainty rested on the same foundation, that the truth was held only by people the powerful had already decided did not count. And a girl gave away her children, and then sat for a portrait she was supposed to hide, and beat a dynasty in open court. A fortune teller from a wagon show printed 1 issue of a newspaper and pulled the halo off a national saint. A reporter had herself locked in a madhouse and walked out with the evidence that freed the women inside it. A runaway wife turned her marriage into a lecture and carried it to the ear of a president. And a quiet woman from the oil country sat at a desk for 2 years and made the richest man on earth explain himself, and he could not. Each of them found the same unlocked door at the back of the same kind of fortress, the door the powerful always forget to bolt, because it never occurs to them that the people they have silenced might one day simply speak. That is the thread, and it does not belong only to the Gilded Age. The specific fortresses fall and new ones rise, but the architecture repeats, and so does the floor, and so, now and then, does the woman who walks through the unlocked door with nothing in her hands but the truth. The names change, the pattern does not. Wherever a powerful thing is built on the confidence that its secrets are safe because the only witnesses are people no one will believe, the door is standing open, and eventually someone walks through it. We tell ourselves that this was the crime of a rougher, darker age, and that is a comfortable lie. The particular fortresses these women faced have mostly fallen, the trust broken, the asylum reformed, the double standard shamed, if never quite killed. But the shape of the thing has not changed at all. Every generation builds its own strongholds on the same foundation, an institution, a fortune, a great man, resting on the certainty that its secrets are safe, because the people who hold them, the employee, the patient, the dependent, the used, and the discarded, are people no one will believe. The certainty is always wrong in the end, and it is always wrong for the same reason. Sooner or later, one of the people who was supposed to stay silent decides not to, and finds that a true sentence, said out loud in the right room, is still the one thing that all the money and all the lawyers in the world cannot unsay. That is the inheritance these 5 women left, and it is worth far more than the fortunes that outlived them. They did not leave us their money, for they had little to leave. They left us a proof, demonstrated 5 times over against 5 different kinds of power. A ruined girl proved it against a dynasty. A fortune teller proved it against a saint. A reporter proved it against the institutions that warehoused the poor. A runaway wife proved it against a prophet and a church. And a quiet historian proved it against the richest man who ever lived. 5 women who never met, who came from 5 different worlds, who wanted 5 different things, all found the same unlocked door at the back of the same kind of fortress, and all walked through it, carrying nothing but the truth. And every one of them, in her own way, brought the walls down. Think, at the last, about why the truth behaved so strangely in these 5 stories, why it did the one thing all that wealth and all that power could not undo. A fortune can be moved, hidden, multiplied, passed down. An institution can be defended, a scandal can be waited out, a rival can be bought or broken. But a true thing, once it has been said in public and taken root in the minds of many people, has no owner and no off switch. It cannot be recalled like a faulty product or foreclosed like a debt. Rockefeller could buy almost anything on earth, and he could not buy back the sentence Ida Tarbell had put into 1,000,000 minds. Beecher had the love of a nation, and it could not unring the bell Victoria Woodhull had struck. That is the peculiar power these women reached for, and the reason it worked. They dealt in the one commodity that grows more solid the more hands it passes through, and that no amount of money has ever learned to destroy. A lie needs constant tending. The truth only needs to be said once, loudly enough, by someone brave enough, in a room where the world can hear. Ida Tarbell, who understood these things better than anyone, left the sentence that says it best, and it was never really about oil at all. She had nothing against their size and their wealth, nothing against the fortress itself. What she could not abide was the lie beneath it, and when she summed up her whole quarrel with the greatest fortune the world had ever made, she wrote a line that could stand as the epitaph for all 5 of these women and every fortress they brought down. They had never played fair, she wrote, and that ruined their greatness for me. The money survived. The greatness did not. And the door at the back of the fortress is still unlocked. If any of these 5 women is new to you tonight, then this channel has done the one thing I most want it to do. So subscribe and stay with me for the next story the record tried to bury. And before you go, tell me in the comments which of these 5 you had never heard of until now, and which of these men you think most deserved exactly what she did to him.